This gospel has a few elements. There's two I would like to talk about today. One is the importance of the sense of the faithful. And then there is the importance of the interpretation of Scripture. Let's start with, firstly, the interpretation of Scripture. We have at the back end of this gospel here the Pharisees, the scribes, who are interpreting the Scriptures, reading the Old Testament to then achieve not a faithful interpretation or reading of Scriptures, but to have a reading of Scriptures that was serving themselves. And sometimes there can be this temptation for ourselves as well, to read the Scriptures and read into a passage things that we want for ourselves, and this may not be part of the will of God. And we need to be careful with this. Here we have a few scribes saying, well, the prophet's not meant to come from Galilee, so how is it that this guy's from Galilee, so we'll just condemn him because he's from Galilee? This is misusing of the Scriptures. Sometimes people can be like this. Or sometimes people develop their own interpretation of Scripture, which suits them, but it's not based upon the experience of the church. It's not a faithful interpretation of Scripture. And sometimes if you have a look at the way some denominations have developed, they've developed sometimes because of individuals or groups of people have decided to throw out all of the role of interpretation right throughout the tradition and just start their own interpretation of Scripture. The way we read Scripture is very important. It's not just we read it, suddenly we read it and there's this idea that comes into our head. We read it within the context of our faith tradition, through the context of the apostles, the saints, right throughout history. We read it within the context of the church. We don't read it in isolation. So interpretation of Scripture is quite important. And when you have an interpretation of Scripture which then goes against basic rights which the Scriptures talk about in other parts, and this is referred to here in this gospel as well, then you know you're going down the wrong path. The scribes are wanting to condemn Jesus, but the Scriptures also say there must be given a proper defence, there must be a proper legal process if you're going to condemn somebody. And they've said, no, we're just going to completely dismiss that. The police say there's nothing for us to arrest him on. And you have Nicodemus, he says, the law does not allow us to pass judgment on a man without giving him a hearing and discovering what he is about. This is what the law says. But then there are some, the scribes are saying, we want to dismiss all of that because we want to interpret Scripture for ourselves, not within the context of the will of God. So that's an important thing. Second point I wanted to talk about was the role of the sense of the faithful. Perhaps the sense of the crowd, you could say. And there should be a sense of the faithful. And we see that here in the gospel as well. The scribes see that the crowd are coming to Jesus. But the crowd are coming from a good place. They haven't been manipulated. They're open to the will of God. And when people are open to the will of God and are seeking the will of God in the context of the community, the church says what we call the sense of the faithful. And all of you together have a sense of the faithful. It's what the faith's about. It's not about power. It's not about control. It's about the will of God and living that out faithfully in the context of our lives, to responding to the presence, the revelation of God in our world. So know that there is a sense of God amongst yourselves. But sometimes if we take where the back end of this gospel is, if we make the Scriptures suit our personal need, we interpret it for ourselves, that goes against the sense of the faithful and it goes against the will of God. So let us know we have a sense of the faithful together when we're all collectively seeking God's will. But there can be the task or the trap that if we become so focused on our own personal need and forget about the sense of God, the will of God, there might be some problems. As we journey now in these final days towards the last 2 weeks of Lent, let us know that we journey together. And let us know that we are faithfully discerning God's will, God's voice in the midst of our Scriptures, in the midst of our tradition as we journey towards Holy Week.